Hi, everybody. Thank you for doing this. So it's actually fun that we're doing this Erev Purim, since the text that we're looking at has to do with Purim, and I want to add another piece to this, which is in the Talmud. It says about Purim, the sort of the corollary of what we talked about, that Purim collections can't be used for anything else as well. So just as the piece that we read said that Maaser, your tithing, can't be used for to pay for the Purim Su'udah, for the Purim meal for the poor. Any money that's collected for tzedakah for Purim can't be used for anything else either. That money has to be used in that celebration. So I guess the question I have to ask you: how fungible do you think money is? In the part that we read from the Talmud, it's really clear that certain money goes for some things and certain money goes for other things. So where and how do you think we have the ability to put money in different categories in different ways?
Reb Mordechai, I was thinking about this actually a little bit ago because when my wife and I give our annual charity, we usually go on a website and we press a button, you know. So on some level, the transfer of electrons feels so insubstantial, even though you look at your statement online and you see that the money did move. It's not there anymore, I just think our whole conceptualization of money nowadays is so fundamentally different from the conceptualization the rabbis had back in the time of the Talmud, where you could, so to speak, allocate, a concrete physical entity, whether money or something worth money, and put it sort of aside for mitzvah X or mitzvah Y, or taxes or what have you. And now it seems that, to me, that the whole sort of category of money is so radically altered because of technology, that we need to rethink sort of what it means for money to be fluid and what does it mean exactly to allocate funds and so on and so forth.
Well, money has certainly become more of an abstraction because of technology.
Absolutely.
And how we deal with it, yeah.
The corollary question might be how has our support for the community also become more abstract? One of the lines in your writing that I found really interesting, though I didn't have a chance to respond to it, was the idea you make the distinction between taxes and tzedakah, and then you throw in the idea about synagogue dues not being tzedakah, but they're not philanthropy either. They're this requirement to maintain communal institutions, and it got me thinking about what are the other, in a time when institutions are changing, what are the analogous institutions to a synagogue in a time when people aren't automatically availing themselves of synagogues, and there are alternate structures. How does that fluidity come into play, and what are our obligations to those institutions, and what are those institutions' obligation to us?
So what do you think those institutions would be? The synagogue isn't tzedakah because there are certain mitzvot, there's certain halakha that can only be performed in a synagogue. So in order for us to fulfill our obligations, we have to have a synagogue to do them in. So they're for our interest as well as the community's. So they're not considered tzedakah. So what kind of institutions do you think we need to support that help us fulfill our obligations, and that money to them should be given without it being considered tzedakah, but that we are obligated to give?
I'm not sure. I think it's an interesting question. I mean, there's a lot of educational organizations out there. Mm-hmm. There are a lot of community organizations. If a JCC or is a JCC or a community mikvah, are they on the same ground if they're performing some of these functions for the community? I don't know. And in a time when we're looking at concepts of peoplehood and other more abstract concepts,
right?
What are our obligations to those as well? I have questions, but I don't have answers necessarily.
I think it's a great set of questions. What are the communal institutions that we are obligated to support in order to maintain Jewish community, which is, at least traditionally, a very separate question from tzedakah, which is clearly to help people who are poor. So it's a whole area of conversation that needs to be had. I think that it's great that you're raising it. And given the diversity of the community, it makes the conversation even more challenging. But it's a conversation that we need to have about the maintenance of communal institutions.
And also on the point of communal institutions, in a more Talmudic time era of the world, I guess there's a little bit more of a blurring of the lines between what was a sort of a Jewish communal institution. If in a community if a community all fell under a Jewish community, and the schools and the various organizations that care for people were all Jewish, then whether by the bucket of tax, tzedakah, or above and beyond philanthropy, we're supporting Jewish institutions. But now in a modern context, you have to more specifically direct your donations to Jewish communities, to Jewish institutions, rather than relying upon those buckets, aside from philanthropy.
Right. So, and then the added challenges in those institutions are who is defining who is Jewish, and what degree of pluralism is in those institutions. That compounds it to yet another level of which communal institutions we are obligated to support, and depending on does it depend on if we agree or don't agree what their definition of being Jewish is, or who is a Jew.
Right.
That certainly makes it a little more complicated. The question of philanthropy as opposed to tzedakah, I'm just curious how the two of you understood that, and what the lines are between philanthropy and tzedakah, and how you understand those lines, and also as well as in terms of your personal practice, how do you make that kind of distinction?
I don't know that I make that distinction between tzedakah and philanthropy, but based on what I can see in the text, from what we studied before writing these responses, there's a more defined sort of purposing for the tzedakah, and the philanthropy allows you, I guess, more flexibility to direct funds towards specific causes or ends.
Right.
Right. It's interesting because I recently got to watch from behind the glass a focus group where they asked Jews off the street about the difference between philanthropy and charity. Uh-huh. And most of them said they were charitable, but philanthropy is something somebody else does. It's something people with a lot of money do, or it's more strategic. So it's funny because living in the world of philanthropy, I use the term philanthropy much more than I use the word charity. When we here at the foundation, a lot of our foundation work is strategic. And we acknowledge the fact that some of it does fall under the guidelines of tzedakah, and some of it does not. And as individuals, it's a family foundation. Right. They look for ways to combine philanthropy and tzedakah, and it's just the foundation is just one vehicle. And in my own personal giving, I've started to look at, where is the line between tzedakah and philanthropy. When I started in this world, I was in and out of the Jewish philanthropic space, and I was thinking in terms of tax deduction. It's a tax deduction. It's charitable giving, and and then as you start to refine thinking, this is actually where being strategic can be a good thing. Is you start thinking about, well, what do I care about, and am I giving to all the things I care about, and then am I doing and then also who is it helping? And when you start breaking it down that way, you're able to sort of look at it from both a secular and more strategic perspective, and also look at it from a Jewish perspective and see, am I reaching those people where we're told we have an obligation to help, or am I just giving to other institutions? And then of course there are the fine lines. If I'm giving to a scholarship fund for a school, to what extent, and it's helping low income students, gray area. And I think the book that helped me the most think about these things, though by no means come to, it's a philanthropic journey. We talk about Jewish journeys, there are philanthropic journeys too, is Jill Jacobs, who really, I think, did a really great job of breaking down some of these questions and providing some guidance in these areas.
Right, her guide is really good. We were colleagues together when she did that, working with Jewish Funds for Justice. I think that's great that you're thinking that way, Dara. The thing that it brings up for me is I was on a Mazon board years ago when Mazon was trying to. It used to give 100% of its money to food pantries and feeding people, and then we had a debate on the board that lasted for 2 or 3 years. Does it make sense to give money for advocacy, because advocacy in the long run is going to feed more people than the amount of money we can raise. If we can raise advocacy to raise the food stamp budget, if there are other ways that we can change government policy to feed more people, isn't that in the long run more effective? So at the end of a couple of years, the board decided yes, and the budget of Mazon is now somewhat evenly divided between actually feeding people directly and spending money on policy. So in terms of when we're figuring out our tzedakah budgets, and if it's supposed to be to help people who are poor, then I think it's reasonable to give money to advocacy groups that are going to change policies so that people who are poor benefit, whether that's directly through food or through housing or through education. But that, to me at least, giving that money, I feel fits under the rubric of tzedakah because it's going to help more people. I'm curious how the two of you think about that.
It's an interesting question, and I find that in doing tax planning and charitable planning with clients, I have many, and I have many, and oftentimes Jewish clients who say, I'd rather donate more and pay, I'd rather donate more to Jewish foundations and Jewish causes that I believe in, and use the deduction to pay less tax to the federal government, who's going to initiate policy, that's going to sort of care for society as a whole, and when I hear things like that, I sort of question, well, what's the right balance of that, and what would happen if if that sentiment continues and people decide that they want to direct to the maximum amount where their money goes, versus allowing the government to disseminate funds in a more sort of balanced or non-denominational way.
in terms of my own position, in terms of the larger values, I feel that it is acceptable. But I think from sort of like a strict halachic perspective, in terms of the laws of tzedakah, the way I understand it anyway is that you need to be benefiting someone directly. In other words, a poor person who's in need directly through the act of giving. So I think it's in the spirit of tzedakah to do that, but I don't necessarily think it accords with the letter of the law.
Dara, you have a thought?
I think advocacy is an important part. I mean, for my own portion, I like a balanced portfolio approach where you try a couple of different strategies, but different people I've spoken to about how giving. Some like to do more of one or more of another. Thinking about what Alex said about directing and controlling donations, I'm a former fundraiser, and I saw how crippling to organizations it be as donors want more and more control. And so thinking about that and aren't willing to provide general operating support. And that's not exactly what we're talking about, but I think a lot about that balance between controlling where our donation goes and giving the people, the organizations that are doing the work, the freedom to make good choices. And along those lines, with the thought of, giving more directly and then giving less to the federal government, I worry that if we take ourselves out of the equation of what the government is terribly inefficient in a lot of ways, but if we remove ourselves from the process completely, do we or minimize our involvement, do we run the risk of having worse outcomes in the long run? So those are just a couple of thoughts dancing around my head.
Right. It's in the spirit of halakha, perhaps, to give money to advocacy groups, and maybe not the letter. And my the reconstructionist approach of halakha evolving is that if we are going to be living in a society that's very different, as Sam said, from a couple of thousand years ago, where government policies really do make a difference, then perhaps we need to say that, yes, affecting government policies about how disadvantaged people are treated has to be an important part of tzedakah, because that is going in the long run to help more people. I think that's a debate that the Jewish community ought to have.